Hello everyone, Bag here. The eternal 8-week patch is upon us, which means you'll have that much more time to decide if any of these units in 3.8 are worth going for. We have Firefly and Dahlia in the first half, Lingsha and Fugue in the second half, and Sunday and Aglaea stapled onto the last 2 weeks. So let's get into what's worth your pulls over the next 8 weeks. Before we get started though, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Loot Bar. Loot Bar is a site that offers discounted prices for top-ups for many different games, including Honkai Star Rail, Genshin, Wuthering Waves, Zenless, and more. To top up, all you need is your UID and region. No personal account information is required. From there, you put in your payment method, and there you go. Thanks to a combination of their base discount and coupons that I got just by logging on, I was able to save 20% off of my purchase. Now the pile of pulls for the Dahlia grows even larger. So if you want to know why this service has such great reviews, and why other large content creators have partnered with them as well, the link is in the description of the video. And thank you again for Loot Bar for being the first ever sponsor on this channel. To start off, the Dahlia is in a very weird place in the meta right now, as she's assisting the break archetype when it's at its lowest point. Objectively, her utility is amazing, removing super break downtime while providing super break and weakness break efficiency, while also providing consistent AoE implants of the carry's element, is just all around an insane amount of support to come out of one unit. The main problem is that all of the units that she wants to work with are relatively old and kind of weak in the meta. The Dahlia mainly serves to bring these units up to around the current standards of a carry, which is not very good timing when we are on the cusp of raising that bar a good amount with whatever 4.x brings. If you want to start investing into Boothill right now, not only will his low-cost performance still not be the most impressive thing in the world, but any potential gap that exists in his performance compared to the competition will only grow wider in the next few months. This harkens back to Fugue's release in 2.7, where her Great Break utility was rendered relatively obsolete when no aspect of Amphoius helped break as the HP inflation rose to absurd degrees. This could 100% happen again with the Dahlia in 4.x, so before anything else, you should be prepared for that. Okay, so that's a lot of doom posting on this unit, but there are some upsides here as well. Break, like Dot or Archer, has the distinction of being in its own little bubble of investment. This is bad in the sense that investing in it is less of an overall account upgrade, but it's good in that it's easy to commit a full team to it without taking teammates from other cores, which has become that much more important with Anomaly Arbitration. Her vertical investment is also very strong, with her E1 and S1 being massive boosts. I don't think either are needed, but I do have the general opinion that if you're going to invest into Break, it shouldn't be half-assed. If you want to have a 2-cost Break team in your account's back pocket for when that team is applicable, then that's fine. But even with the Dahlia, don't expect them to clear too fast without heavy optimization. The difference between this team at E0 S0 versus going Sustainless, getting E1 round May, getting the Battle Pass Lycone, and having either the Dahlia's E1 or S1 is pretty large, all things considered. Part of what makes Sustainless runs viable in the first place is that they clear fast enough before dying. And while Firefly can at least sustain herself, generally speaking, it'll be harder to access Break's ceiling of strength if you can't clear fast enough with Sustainless in the first place to make it viable to use. I think the very easy thing to say about the Dahlia is that if you care about Break and its current carries, and you want to make them strong, she should be your first priority. And if you don't care about Break, then she is a must skip, unless if you just want to get her for aesthetic reasons, I guess. The more interesting question is, should you care about Break in the current context of the meta? I think from a cost perspective, revitalizing a foundation of Break that already exists on your account with just getting the Dahlia does have its merits. She allows for you to flex an entire new archetype to better fit into stage buffs, enemy gimmicks, and so on, while letting you regain utility from existing units on your account who have been collecting dust. That is a lot to get from one 5-star. Even if these Break carries won't be setting completely new highs on your account, it's still a lot of utility that's worth at least considering. But if you want to start investing into Boothill, Rappa, or Firefly, and you have no bones of the Break archetype to build off of, then getting her is a very hard idea to recommend. Whenever the next Break carry comes around, whether that's in 4.x or whatever, should also then likely be much more important to the overall meta, sort of like what happened to Sparkle with Archer's release. Right now, there just isn't a modern unit that needs her, which is akin to Cypher's release when she came out, but the difference with Cypher is that she could live off of her very broadly applicable utility to easily find uses on an account as a flex option, where the question was then how useful that flexiness actually was. The Dahlia, meanwhile, has literally zero flexiness, which makes her standing on a given account much more easy to measure. With those previously mentioned merits in pulling her, there's also the reality of how much of an improvement she is to Break standing in the overall meta. If you have a very well-built account with the best current carries, and you want to raise the bar of your account's maximum strength by investing into the newest unit, the Dahlia will probably not do that for you unless if you have a highly invested into Break carry that's just lying around. At base, she will let your Break units stand alongside the Amphoius cast, and that's also with the stipulation of making Sustainless work. And to be clear, when I say stands alongside the 3.x cast, I'm not saying the upper crust level. Like, Firefly Firefly will not be Mono Remembrance or Anoxis Cyrene sustainless levels of good, as Break still is a good bit below that. That is still miles better than where it was pre-Dahlia, but as we talked about at length with Cyrene, we're currently looking to see how fast and furious will be power crept going into 4.x. So rising to meet them this late is like entering a bus as it slowly rolls off a cliff. Alright, maybe it's not that drastic, but you get the point. Overall, the Dahlia is a very meaningful upgrade to an archetype that is not essential to invest into in the slightest. She does bring Break back into the spotlight, and if you already care about Break, then that's all you'd ever ask of her, and she does that job just fine. But if you do not have any unique interest in Break, and you just want to sniff out the next Mono Remembrance level investment to carry your account with, then I'm rather confident in saying that it would be a smarter idea to save for whatever 4.x has to offer. In that sense, you can probably guess my thoughts on newly investing into Firefly right now in 3.8. Is she worth getting without also getting the Dahlia? No, not even remotely. But if you like her and you want to make her work, and you're willing to get the Dahlia for her, then she can genuinely be impressive for today's standards with the right amount of investment. The Dahlia has specific things in her kit that essentially act as a mini half Nova Flare for Firefly, removing her ult down time, giving her a fixed amount of extra toughness damage, and giving a 30% speed buff. Firefly is nothing like how she was pre-Dahlia, but as we've discussed, that doesn't make her outright worth getting for from a meta perspective, unless if you like her. Firefly E2 is also worth getting before any vertical investment on Fugue or Dahlia, so long as you don't have any other break carries that would also benefit from the support's vertical investment, including future break carries. But if you do have an E0 Firefly and you want to supercharge her alongside getting the Dahlia, then pulling for another 2 copies of her is one way of doing so. If we go back to the prospect of there eventually being a 4.x break carry or 5.x or whatever, then getting Firefly makes a lot less sense. If you already have Firefly and then you get the Dahlia for her, then it's natural to replace Firefly with a new break carry when the time comes. That's just the life cycle of a carry in this game. But if you're just getting Firefly now, then in this hypothetical, her lifespan would be way shorter than expected, assuming you do then also decide to end up going for this hypothetical new break carry. This, again, does not matter at all if all you care about is making her strong because you like her. But in a purely meta sense, I think the best scenario for break is if you already have the foundations for the Dahlia to slide into. Building things from the ground up for Firefly is just way too expensive to recommend, unless if you are really committed. I'll plug you to subscribe. I'll keep it short here, but if you want this type of coverage for 4.0 and onwards, then sub and stick around. Alright, back to the vid. With all of the groundwork that I've set, the second phase units should be relatively quick to talk about. No, Lingsha is not needed at all for break. It's an archetype that is uniquely situated to work sustainless for its peak performance, even in spite of how good Lingsha or Gallagher are at their jobs, or things like the Dahlia's first trace. So getting an entire 5-star for an obsolete role is just not a good look. And if we do want to use the example of the footage currently playing on screen, then this goes back to what I've talked about with low investment teams. The goal with break is to not need a sustain if you're able to break and kill fast enough. My boot hill is not on that level, yet. So especially for a fight like with Hule, I needed to fall back to Gallagher. The solution to a faster clear here is to make boot hill's clearing speed faster, either to make running a sustain not as bad, or to make going sustainless more feasible. Pulling to replace Gallagher with Lingsha here is just not an optimal play. Yes, she can be good for Rappa or Himiko in longer pure fiction fights, especially thanks to the Dahlia's guaranteed occasional fire implants, but in my opinion she's just not worth pulling just for that role. This also goes for her uses as an AoE hitting support for the Herda, or as a follow-up attack support for Fei Xiao, but in those roles she's just generally outclassed these days, so I would say no. The real new thing to see with Lingsha is her increased prevalence as a carry in AoE scenarios, as the Dahlia massively increases her potential thanks to her being a sustain and a carry, which lets her get an extra 80 to 100% break effect from the Dahlia's first trace. So you can use her either in AoE fights that aren't fire weak so long as the Dahlia's implants can keep up with the enemy spawning in, which the Dahlia cannot do in pure fiction, or she works even better in AoE fire weak fights, including fire weak pure fictions. She can also work in non-5 target scenarios of course, but there's diminishing returns at that point in using her over any other non-AoE carry. Again, I think this is more so a thing that she's good for your account if you already have her, where you then get the Dahlia, where I still think getting the Dahlia only for her in that context would still not be very worth it in my opinion. If you're trying to build a Lingsha team from the ground up, I think that's even less worth it than doing so with Firefly. But if you like her, go for it. I can't recommend it as a general good thing to invest into without some added personal interest attached to it, but in fights that are well suited for her, she does do a very good job. Fugue is the secondary break support behind the Dahlia, and as we've discussed at length, if you want to properly bring the 2.x break carries back in the spotlight, stopping at only getting the Dahlia will probably not be that great of an idea, at least generally. For Boot Hill and Rappa, Fugue is as much if not more important than the Dahlia for them. For Firefly, Fugue is still extremely competitive, but it is much more easy to replace her with HMC, especially if Ron Mei is properly properly pulling her own weight with E1 and maybe the Battle Pass Lycone. The question with Firefly is if you're willing to give her the Trailblazer when RMC is incredibly good, and we are likely to get another Trailblazer soon in 4.0. Fugue does become a lot more relevant at E2 Firefly for the more consistent breaks, however, so if you do already have that investment, then she is a lot more worth going for. If you are going for Fugue, then it's pretty well known that her Eidolons are also incredibly good, as both her E1 and E2 are on relatively equal footing with the Dahlia's E1 and S1 generally, where Fugue's S1 is then always the lowest priority and is generally skippable. For Boot Hill, I would say the priority still leans towards E1 Fugue, then either Dahlia E1 for an easier time meeting toughness thresholds, or S1 for better damage. Although if something like Pearl's or Cypher's Light Cone helps with getting to 100% Depth Shed for him, then her signature is a lot worse to prioritize. For Rappa, I would honestly just book it to E2 Dahlia, as it's by far the best upgrade that you can get in pure fiction runs. And then beyond that, it's a toss-up between E1 Fugue for better toughness damage, or S1 Dahlia for better actual break damage. For Firefly, Fugue's E1 got a lot less needed post Dahlia, since speeding up breaking does a lot less for her compared to what it does for Boot Hill and Rappa, so Dahlia S1 and E1 would be the better support investment. Although again, it does get a lot more worth it if you also go for E2 Firefly. Fugue's E2 is really good, and it is definitely something worth going for, but not before getting baseline investments for each carry that help achieve either damage or toughness thresholds. My overall thoughts is that Fugue is the number 2 priority for your account for break teams, unless if you can fully plan around getting her as a Firefly main. Other than that, I don't think it's worth investing into Boot Hill or Rappa without her, but seeing as they aren't on these banners, this only really applies if you already have them and you don't have Fugue, I guess, which I'm guessing doesn't apply to a lot of people. Also, obviously, Fugue and Dahlia are on separate banners, so you can't go back and forth investing into them at the same time. I would say to just be careful with investing into the Dahlia to make sure you have enough pulls to get whatever Fugue investment you want. Going all in on the Dahlia when you need and don't have E0 Fugue can be pretty disastrous, so try not to push your luck. It can also be suspected that the Dahlia will rerun faster than Fugue, maybe, so if you're going to vertically invest in both of them, it's a reasonable bet to prioritize Fugue's Eidolons first if you plan on getting the Dahlias later. Also because Fugue is after the Dahlia, so you have a better idea with how many pulls you're working with. Now, let's switch gears from talking about break entirely with the third half units of Aglaea and Sunday. Aglaea is a very weird unit to talk about, as she has rightfully gained a reputation as a very expensive unit to make work. While her baseline performance at E0 S0 has been fine so far, the standard expectation, where you have to invest more and more into a unit the older they are, dictates that her very good E1 will be more of an expectation going forward. If you care only about clearing, it'll probably make more sense to save for 4.x, but if you want to make Aglaea work, there are a few stipulations. Again, her E1 is a legitimate game changer. I think it's uncontroversial to call it the best E1 for a carry in the entire game by a decent margin. You don't need it, but at the very least you should consider getting it on a future rerun if you don't have enough to get it now. For her team, the standard team would be Sunday, Robin or Cyrene, with Cyrene being pretty decently better, especially if you don't have E1 Robin, and Dipped or Ho-Ho. Sunday is technically replaceable with RMC if you have Cyrene, and you also really want Ho-Ho over any other sustain if you don't have Cyrene. If you don't have some workable combination of these units to give her, then things can get rough, as her free-to-play alternatives are far below her standard best-in-slot team. And it then becomes the same conversation as Firefly, where building something like an Aglaea team from the ground up is really not worth going for unless if you like her and you specifically want to make using her work. But with investment, I do think Aglaea is still a very impressive carry for today's standards. I can't call it an objectively good idea to go for her and her E1, but it won't be a waste if you want to make her work. Her signature is also very good, but it's a lot lower of a priority before making a good team for her and getting her E1, where by that level of investment, it's not really needed to make her work. And this same line of thinking also goes for Firefly, by the way, except I do think Firefly's signature is worse for her compared to how good Aglaea's signature is for Aglaea. And then lastly, Sunday is also kinda weird to discuss. For being an incredibly universal unit, with his broadly applicable action advance, crit buffs, and energy regen, he has fallen a bit victim to Starvel's recent trend of tailor-made supports outshining universal supports on a given team. Specifically, in the current lineup of the meta, he has lost a lot of his uncontested best-in-slot teams, losing out on Maide and Inoxa, while becoming not nearly as essential anymore for Aglaea or Finon. The only real meta-relevant carries that he's best-in-slot for are Saber, Blade and Jingliu, Yunli, Jingyuan, and then again Finon and Aglaea. But then again, one of his main strengths is how broadly applicable his utility is. He may not always be best-in-slot, but your account only has one Cyrene, and with how many teams can use him on a very competitive level, that is still an important role that he can very competently fill. I also think it's pretty easy to say that he will age as a support better than the likes of Cyrene. me, especially with Dip's existence making his summon requirement not nearly as demanding. An SP comfortable action advancer with energy buffing will always have some place in the meta. That being said, maybe 4.x will go down the pipeline of having carries that aren't even competitive when using generic supports, instead needing specific utility to be worth using. In a scenario like that, a unit like Sunday becomes a lot less worth pulling for now. I would say though, from an overall meta perspective, Sunday is the best unit in 3.8 to go for. It's generally pretty easy to find a use for him on your account, and the flexibility that he allows for in team building is incredibly underrated. That being said, I do still think he is relatively easy to skip as we go into 4.0. Also, his Lycone is pretty dang good. Its buffing isn't bad, its buffs last for multiple turns, as opposed to Bronya's signature, which is important in -1 speed setups. It gives self-energy, which means more frequent ults, which is useful as he is then able to generate additional SP. It is a very comfortable option that does make a tangible difference, especially with Sparkle using it in an Archer team, but I would still say it's not needed to make him work or anything like that. I would also be stupid not to mention that DDD is on this half's banner, so for him or Aglaea, that might be an extra incentive if you are lacking on DDD copies. So with saying Sunday is the best unit here, and saying he's still rather skippable in the grand scheme of things, I think you already know my overall thoughts here. All of the worthwhile units here are more so good at making old units work better if you like them. Fugue and Dahlia do that great with break carries, while Sunday is more for comfortability, or maybe needing him in his few remaining best in slot teams. Firefly and Aglaea are workable so long as you give them at least a little bit of investment, but they're not really worth newly investing into with how the meta currently is. And Lingsha is just that, while also being rather limited in her use cases. If you want to save for 4.x, I think it'll be pretty easy to justify doing so. But, with that being said, I will be live on patch day spending 550 pulls for the Dahlia, so if you see me live, then come wish me luck. Going to the channel member corner, we have I Love You Applaud as our next new member. Thank you so much for joining, and with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Bye!